All right. Perhaps we should get started. Seems like nobody else is coming in. So my name is Brian Lander. I teach the environmental history of ancient China in the history department and in the Institute at Brown for Environment and Society. And I'm honored to be here. So I'll just introduce the two speakers and then we can get going. Macarena Gómez-Barris is the chair in the Department of Social Sciences and Cultural Studies at the Pratt Institute. She has written several books. The Extractive Zone is the most recent one. It's called The Extractive Zone, Social Ecologies and Decolonial Perspectives, which theorizes social life through extractive scenes of ruinous capitalism upon indigenous territories. She has also published Where Memory Dwells, Culture and State Violence in Chile, and soon to come out will be Beyond the Pink Tide, Art and Politics in the Americas. And I guess the practice today is to introduce both speakers at once. So our second speaker will be Astrida Neimanis, who is a senior lecturer at the University of Sydney in the Department of Gender and Cultural Studies, and who is a feminist environmental humanist and also scholar of water, author of Bodies of Water, Post-Human Feminist Phenomenology, and also is a prominent scholar of environmental humanities and of water, and among other things, the assistant editor in the Journal of Environmental Humanities. Okay, so thank you to both of our speakers, and we will begin with Professor Gómez-Barris.
Good. Good afternoon. Thank you so much for the invitation to be here. I'm excited to be in conversation with so many interesting scholars on these questions. And so far, it's been an enlivened discussion. And so thank you for engaging me in this work now. So today, I'm really extending the findings from my recent book, The Extractive Zone, that methodologically considers how to decolonize the Anthropocene in 5 scenes of ruinous extractive capital. I refer to how we might reposition the temporalities of colonial capitalist exhaustion and violence where the apocalypse has already taken place, especially in the vulnerable spaces of the global south and upon indigenous territories. And we might kind of unpack what I mean by the global south in a particular moment. Here, I name the extractive zone as colonial capitalism's ransacking of non-renewable natural resources, particularly within dense and heterogeneous eco-pools. And I'm mindful of the language of biodiversity because in and of itself, it doesn't do a lot of work to describe the spaces of deep resource areas and sometimes can write out the very way that deserts, for instance, are rich biodiverse spaces as well. But I'm also interested in the kind of referencing of military violence to show those transits and cross currents in terms of cultural appropriation and representational forms of extraction, in particular upon indigenous bodies. And I also want to suggest that some of that work travels through a number of different spaces in the Americas, but I want to focus on these particular ones, or at least I did in the book, and that is through petroleum dependency and the industry and the kind of web of complicity in eastern Ecuador upon Quechua territories. And I don't speak indigenous languages, but I did pick up some along the way in in-depth fieldwork over 8 years in South America. Then I did something a little bit non-normative and went to spiritual tourist industry to think about the kind of insights of extractive capitalism upon bodies, right, in terms of indigenous bodies themselves. And there I was working with ghetto communities in relationship to ghetto transits. Then looking at Cerro Potosí, silver and tin mining in Bolivia, and earlier what was mentioned was Pachamama, the idea of earth rights and climate rights, and I do a very, very close reading through Feminist Constitution, a rewriting of earth rights, and suggest that perhaps we have to look further beyond the kind of nation's use of decolonization and not be so celebratory, but in fact look at the forms of patriarchal and ecofeminisms, or anti-patriarchal and ecofeminisms that challenge some of those state measures. I also look at the little-known case of Mapuche and Pehuenche uprisings in southern territories in Chile, and these are spaces like the EZLN and Zapatista uprisings in Chiapas that are very connected to extractive industries that go against the kind of territorialization of non-forest or monocultural production in terms of pine and eucalyptus, right? Because they're not forests, since nothing grows under that kind of monocultural pine plantation. And then finally, I look at hydroelectricity in Cauca, Colombia, and look at a series of aesthetic and activist interventions in relationship to rivers and the potential extinction that we're facing now in relationship to river and river production. So that's part of the project that also looks at some of the limitations of human rights. So in my talk today, I extend that work, but I also extend my earlier work on memory in the category of disappearance that I research and where memory dwells. And this was really in relationship to the shock doctrine of Milton Friedman trained Chicago boys that really argued about the torture and disappeared and looked at the long shadow of U.S. imperialism and how it was conducted through a military dictatorship that paid, certain kinds of dissident subjects paid for the social burden of the neoliberal global economy. The disappeared, of course, gave primary reference to those constituted by the modern nation state as political subversives, but said less about those disappeared prior to Pinochet's Chile or the dispossessed. So the image actually on the book is of the disappeared, a memorial by the Mapocho River in Santiago of Puente Bulnes, a small commemoration that makes witness to dozens of people whose bodies were thrown into the river in Mapocho. So I just want to start with that to say that I've long had a kind of obsession with this kind of ontological category of disappearance. So the title of my talk, Disappearing Archipelagos, plays at least on 4 tropes within our vocabularies and cultural imaginaries that are animated by the period of capitalist colonial exhaustion. And this is the main term that I'll be using for the Anthropocene in terms of the proliferating vocabulary upon it. So first, really the idea of disappearing archipelagos refers to geophysical disappearance, or how the rising tides of global climate change that we're experiencing today, right, literally swallows or will swallow entire island nations. These are geographies that have always been liquid, but are becoming increasingly more liquid as we speak. Second, I refer to disappearing archipelagos as a kind of erasure of continental thinking. And even in that flash image, the quick image I showed you, there's a centering of continental mass that I kind of want to decenter today. So these are the kind of archipelagic or minor regions that we might bring to the foreground. What does it do to bring the minor to the foreground? The erasures occur obviously through state militarism, policy, and other realms of formal political activity that reinforce the globalized difference of island geographies as marginal and peripheral spaces. So again, working against the idea of contiguous landmass rather than island and archipelago formations. I also use the idea of disappearing archipelagos as a synonym for mare nullius, or the idea that seas belong to no one, or that the sea is inhabited by no one, rendering vacant geographies in spaces that have long been inhabited by indigenous peoples. Fourth, I invoke the idea of disappearing archipelagos to speak very specifically about the Patagonian archipelago geographies of the Ona and Sucnam peoples. The material histories of the Patagonian indigenous ontologies do a lot of work to rewrite the history of state violence. So in those 4 points, I give you everything that's going to be, I'm going to try to unpack over the next 25 minutes or so, okay? So Patagonia represents an area of more than 400,000 square miles, and that spans across modern Chile and Argentina. The narrow wedge of land in the southern hemisphere and on the margins of the continent is dominated by the sea. As geographers have noted, oceanography and oceanic-induced climatic factors have greatly contributed to the evolution of the region and the land-sea interrelationship that characterizes the evolution of any coastal region in the world. Of course, it plays more, this kind of ocean-sea relationship plays more of a significant role in a place like Patagonia. Patagonia is also often visualized as a territory without inhabitants, as many island spaces are. So here, in the ideology of terra nullius, the colonial gaze empties territories of indigenous peoples to facilitate colonialism's acquisition. That should be no news to you. But for century in this specific location, the Sucnam, the Ona, the Haush, and other indigenous peoples inhabited the tip of South America, living upon a fragmented landscape that appears as 1,000 islands surrounded by sea rather than as any coherent landmass. We might also consider how Mare Nullius names the colonial fiction of the sea as a space with no juridical claims by indigenous peoples, or how state conceptions of property and boundary making in coastal areas distort and indeed fragment the memory of indigenous marine spaces and cultural histories. Archipelagic spaces, depends on how you pronounce that, are organized by these continuities of land and sea that underlie indigenous perspectives. And in fact, it's about this kind of reorientation that I'm interested that we consider for our own work. In Chilean exile and documentarian Patricio Guzman's most recent film, The Pearl Button, the idea of terra nullius, of land and sea, or even mare nullius, is disrupted through a number of several important counter-cartographic gestures and inverted and submerged perspectives. And here I'm trying to document forms of visuality that actually go against the extractive gaze. So the views that we can actually pull from aesthetics and new forms of the kind of counter-mapping, counter-technologies that I'm very interested that we raise. In a powerful sequence that fabricates the artist's unfolding of a handmade paper map, we begin to reveal the improbability of Chile's long territorial geography. This is a territory that is too long to fit within the confines of one filmic take. So instead, there's just a long view on this unfolding of a paper map and very close attention to where the landscape actually fragments, which I'm really interested in the work of the camera there. The viewer is presented with the preposterous view of a skinny nation that is flanked by the Andes mountain chain and by the Pacific Ocean, or what ultimately is referred to by historian Gabriel Salazar as an island. And this really does decenter continental thinking, but because to think of the long kind of coastline there of Chile's orientation is absolutely central to thinking differently about the nation state, but it's so kind of counter-normative that it's rarely done in that way. So I feel like there's some important work that's being done here. When the camera finally settles on the southern tip of Chile and Argentina, the viewer becomes aware of the continental breakage all along the southernmost edge of South America. Again, islands scatter into a body of water. More ocean than land mass, national limits begin to blur into the sea, geographically troubling the neat containment of the nation-state's political geography and how we think about the boundaries of the hemisphere. Potentially of interest to us here in terms of our Extra Earthly Matters project, the Pearl Button takes the Patagonian region as the center of broader astrophysical and extraterritorial reflections, which is characteristic of Guzman's cinematic episteme. Interspersing shots of the galaxies with ocean waves, Guzman narrates how, quote, "As I watched the stars, I began to learn about the importance of water," end quote. In the next breath, he says, quote, "Life was brought to Earth by the comets that shaped the seas," end quote. With this opening, Guzman begins to connect the stars to the Earth's oceans, a theme he draws upon throughout the film to describe the region and the cultural practices of its original inhabitants. And of course, this includes 5 groups, the Kaweskar, the Saknam, the Ainokin, the Haush, and the Yananma, or what colonizers first named the Fuegan peoples, who travel by sea into the fragments of the archipelago. In the next scene, we move to a satellite overview shot of western Patagonia, the region that forms the longest watery boundary of Chile and where the Andes sinks into the sea only to reemerge again into the Thousand Islands. As Guzman puts it, quote, "This is a timeless place, an archipelago of rain," end quote. Now, of course, we know from the melting of the ice shelves and the warming of the ocean's temperatures that this is not a timeless region at all, but one profoundly transformed by human and colonial imprint. Referring to the Ona and Saknam peoples, Guzman states, quote, "They lived submerged in the water and they ate what the water supplied," end quote. And it's only much later that, in contrast to this poetic gaze, we bear witness to the full violence of the genocidal occupation by Australian and then British military forces, by sheep herders, and by the vigilantes, which I'll return to shortly. I also want to draw attention to this kind of diving perspective that if you look at a lot of indigenous cultures, if you look at certain parts of, certain islands off of Korea, that the kind of diving female cultures around certain kinds of socialities and below, the sea does a lot to really play with the idea of the human, right, and the submerged or the non-human. So I guess I want to defer a little bit to the work that Branca brought so beautifully forward on the scientific expedition, and to say that this is kind of new work for me, but what I'm interested in is thinking about the kind of scientific expeditions in the 19th century. And I'd name this as a kind of era of scientific exploration and expansionist extractivism, where the Fuegan peoples did orient themselves to the ocean and the sky, and that was reflected in the language and relational understandings to embodiment, to questions of water, and to the cosmos above. But what does it mean to actually document these practices, right? So a 19th century photographic collection from the British Colonial Archive is a centerpiece of pre-colonial evidence of a different ontology in relationship to land, sea, sky. And for me, it's interesting to detain upon this kind of filmic visuality that moves between blue ice, rogue waves of the sea, and I'm interested in the idea of the rogue wave and what it does, right? A darkened starry night, and the colonial images of indigenous death, which I'll unpack in a minute. So how might we consider something like indigenous cultural matrices that are enveloped within sea and sky? What are these inhuman landscapes? And here I'm drawing upon Mel Chen and Dana Luciana's work to name that category of the inhuman, the earth and the cosmos, without falling prey to something like ethnographic entrapment. And this is a work of Mohawk scholar Audra Simpson that contions us into this, territory. How we think about these images matters a lot, right? Scholar of colonialism Ann Stoller has also forcefully asked us to consider what forms of representation visualize the impossibility of the colonial archive to deliver historical truth. And, Guzman is really interested in this idea of historical truth and ponders on the audio track, what are we really bearing witness to with these images? What are we really seeing? So again, I want to think about an extractive visuality or forms of colonial images that require a decolonial analysis to kind of even engage them. So more specifically, the images from the British Archive on Patagonia show how the paint on the bodies of Fuegan peoples reflected the ontological orientation to stars and to oceans. What about where the body began and the self blur into the surround? And how can we not make easy divisions between the human body and the natural world in this way? So again, I'm interested in this blurring, not binarizing the human and not human, and I think this image does so, but I show it with a lot of care, okay? So to contextualize these images in a long sequence that draws from historical footage of the arrival of the British to Patagonia in 1883, we might think about the asymmetries that are in such spaces of encounter. And that's part of the work that Guzman does when he says, quote, "They arrived, the colonists, the gold diggers, the military, the police, the sheep herders, the Catholic missionaries. After living centuries with the water and the stars, the indigenous suffered an eclipse of their world," end quote. In a lot of ways, the director here is confronted with a very pragmatic problem. Given that the Colonial Archive cannot fully bear witness to such brutality, what strategies of representation can fill the void of colonial and nationalist historiography? So here is where there's a return to this kind of British photographs and the series of collected images that visualize the violence documented within the archive of settler colonialism. And there is a move here to actually show the British militia manhunts against the native Ona peoples and the Protestant and Catholic disciplining that was indigenous religious conversion. We're forced here as viewers to consider the colonial basis of what Nelson Maldonado Torres calls, quote, the master morality narrative, end quote, and he's referring here to modernity's paradigm of war. In fact, British documentation of indigenous genocide is thoroughly inscribed within photographs that bear witness to Darwinian ideologies that are behind this kind of understanding of indigenous death. So again, thinking about a scale rather than just two binary terms between human and non-human, how is it that the Ona and the Selknam people suffer within this kind of racial hierarchies that are appropriated to this space? So by approximating this archive of death, Guzman is able to position the history of Patagonia within broader processes and histories of colonial exploration, occupation, and elimination. At the same time, Guzman considers the complexity of Patagonian epistemes and indigenous life that reside in the margin of the archive. In the film, listening to the water, listening to the sounds of water, visualizing the iceberg surroundings, while layering the audio with the narrative of Patagonia's colonial history, inserts the viewer into a poetic geography that perhaps objectifies the landscape and perhaps problematically serves to soften the blow of the violent force of colonial histories. You might know that beginning in 1883, Charles Darwin made 3 expeditions to Patagonia on the HMS Beagle that was commanded by Captain Robert Fitzroy, who held at least 4 Fuegan peoples captive aboard those journeys, taking them to England as part of an ethnological experiment. Indeed, Patagonian history is replete with these explorers, scientific expeditions, police, military, and sheep settled within the Southern Territories upon the bodies of indigenous peoples. Beginning in 1898, the British colonizers formed the Society for Exploitation of Tierra del Fuego, whose aim was either to kill, capture, or relocate indigenous peoples in order to resettle the space by dedicating large estancias to sheep herding. These violent occupations were rationalized through the doctrine, as I mentioned, of social Darwinism. And historian Mateo Martinic B., there's not a lot of work on this, but I think some of the Chilean historians and indigenous historians are now surfacing some of these discussions. Martinic's work shows how nationalist historiography evaded the Chilean state's complicity in genocidal violence. But there is certainly a broader story to tell here about the colonial project's dependency upon extractive zones, to go back to the earlier work I mentioned, particularly the wool and sheep industries that work to disappear the histories of occupation, religious conversion, and colonial violence within the nation's memory. Fuegan peoples could not escape the brutality of the British forces or the rapid expansion of these industries on the one hand, and the missionaries and military on the other, which continues to structure the colonial wound. In the Pearl Button, Guzman shows how Fuegan peoples had no options within what Patrick Wolf has referred to as the elimination of the native. And in Kehaulani Kewani's reading of the circulation of the phrase, she reminds us that Wolf's original intent with settler colonialism was that it was an enduring structure rather than a single event or a single period of colonization. So then, in relation to the visual footage and on the soundtrack, Guzman says, quote, "The Chilean government supported the British and declared that the native peoples were corrupt, sheep thieves, and barbaric. Many found in Isla Dawson, where the central mission was stationed, a certain kind of refuge. They took their language, their beliefs, and their customs," end quote. And this kind of nostalgic tone is apparent in a lot of his documentaries, but it comes full force here. While narrating the role of religion, this were the expeditions, the Darwin expeditions. It's a map that charts the 3 different expeditions that goes all the way to the Cape the Cape Horn. So, in a particular scene that deals with Dawson Island, the viewer is privy to images of indigenous women who are weaving in the mission system while nuns oversee their labor. In front of the nuns, a row of indigenous girls wears brown costumes. And the scene really takes on increasingly terrifying proportions as you see the colonial disciplinary society coming fully into view, structured by the colonial religious hierarchies that actively work to erase the cultural traditions of indigenous women and girls. There's little commentary about the gendered character of Patagonia's occupation in the film, or the practice of civilizing Native women and girls by incorporating them into the life of the mission, as was common in colonies across the Americas. So while Guzman mostly attends to these details of the history with a careful hand, in this filmic sequence, he unknowingly invokes Catholic rather than Catholic and Protestant missionaries, which leads him to slip between Spanish and English forms of colonization in the region. Despite the slip, Guzman weaves a historical account of state terror as a palimpsest of memory, where the spatial overlap between zones of occupation becomes part of the colonial and neo-colonial logic of containment that is difficult for the ONA and SUGNAM, or impossible to escape. And I just want to kind of highlight here that I am pointing to space of concentration that's called Dasa Island. So again, another kind of disappearing archipelago. The title of the film, El Botón de Nacer, The Pearl Button, is taken from the colonial story of Jemmy Button, who was a captive on one of these voyages that I mentioned. Alongside 3 other indigenous captives, he was taken when he was 12 years old, and Jemmy Button was sold for the price of a pearl button, thus the title of the film. He was supposedly returned after 3 years on a civilizing trip to England, and he was charged with the mission, the expansionist mission of bringing light to Tierra del Fuego. Within the numerous colonial stories about him, Jemmy Button has been alternately represented as a race trader, a trickster figure, and a celebrated or exceptionalized indigenous figure. Here I would say that the submerged perspective is a story of Jemmy Button and how his kind of own narrative is impossible to uncover as it's buried within layers of colonial mediation. The pearl button becomes part of 2 stories that are suturing the colonial and modern divide, or as part of colonial modern violence. Guzman chases the pearl button as its material evidence of the trade of Jemmy Button to the British military forces. But this story also foreshadows the finding of a pearl button at the bottom of the Pacific Ocean a century later that was preserved on the clothing of an Allende supporter that had been flown over the sea and whose body was dumped within a piece of a train, with a piece of a train track in order to disappear the body deep into the ocean and leave no trace. So by focusing on the narratives of 2 pearl buttons, one that symbolizes the colonial genocidal violence against Tierra del Fuego indigenous peoples, and the second during the Cold War, against dissident subjects, Guzman is able to show us how the narratives that dwell in the undercurrents reveal a longer arc of using the sea as a death technology. So we often are thinking again about the sea in ways that don't kind of reveal these forms of violence, and again disappearing the colonial and modern trace in the Americas. In an important and characteristic sequence about human rights testimonials with those survivors of Pinochet's repression in Chile, Guzman narrates the history of Dawson Island again, this time through the site of subversive capture in the 1970s. So Dawson Island functions here not only as a symbol of the failure of modernity, but as a site of trans-temporal colonial and military occupation for those deemed inhuman, subhuman, etc. In other words, Dawson Island was twice used to disappear populations that could not be squared with extractive and later the neoliberal capitalist project. So first Selknam peoples and Ona peoples and later socialists and communists. And what the witnesses are doing there are pointing to the place of captivity. So Dawson Island is just right across the ocean there. So let me play for you this.
Una vez mi mamá, estamos en una isla, eso fue por ahí cerca de Natal, por afuera. No sé, en qué parte. Me mandaron porque no teníamos agua, no había pozo, no había río, no había nada. Que nosotros salimos a buscar agua. Al frente había un río. Ese tiempo ya sabía remarse un poco, no era tanto. Para remar, tiene que tener fuerza. No es fácil, no es fácil. Cuando hay viento, largó viento y nos pillaron un viento, nos pudimos llegar a eso, a este campamento nosotros. Por eso los oxígenos tenían que remar por cualquier cosa, puede salvarse. Dice, no es lindo dejar y yo no sé, remar y no puedo, o remar no puedo hacerlo. Tenía que hacerlo por fuerza. Yo me prendí a ver a bucear, me hicieron bucear,
Durante un verano, uno de mis amigos del colegio se lo llevó en una. Iba saltando de roca en roca, en medio de las olas que entraban como garras entre los arrecifes. Su cuerpo nunca apareció. Fue mi primer desaparecido.
So, listening to Gabriela's testimony here is both about what is lost, and we might consider the kind of nostalgic tone again in the mourning of those kind of cultural practices that are lost, but also in relationship to her own indigenous nations catastrophe, right? The clip to me upends how we understand human rights testimonials, and we might switch and think about something like environmental testimonials or other forms of kind of genres that are doing a particular kind of work to raise these issues today, and things that we might be able to genres we might be able to analyze for some of this kind of work. But the sequence also follows some of the kind of project of cultural rescue that Guzman is after, which is literally to foreground the language and culture of indigeneity in relationship to Gabriela's as a last survivor. There are only something like 200 survivors left here. And one of the things I wanted to point out here is that his work is to both translate to the Spanish and to Yanama a series of words. So he says boat or barco, and she gives the indigenous counterpart. He says sea, she gives the indigenous counterpart. But when he gets to police, she says there is no word for that. When he gets to military, she says there is no word for that. And so we might note how this becomes part of this kind of absent, vocabulary as well in relationship to kind of colonialism and what that means in relationship to seas. So for me, part of the work here is to dwell in these other kinds of spaces, right? The kind of archipelago spaces of the concentration camp. Again, that works against the romantic view of the archipelago. And the lingering images of the vitality of oceanic space. And I think it's important that he's dwelling in both. And in the extractive zone, I actually take on new materialisms very forcefully through indigenous ontologies to suggest that, in fact, we have to kind of have this longer arc of what we mean by oceanic vitality, earthly vitality, etc. We might also think about how the sea becomes this overdetermined space and also a connecting force of fragmented landmass, fragmented histories, a repository of historical memory, and that ultimately repositions our understanding of state and militarized violence. So another way to think about that is that it's not mare nullius, but the archipelago is saturated with memory and historical memory. Finally, the reorientation to southern and archipelago geographies helps us reimagine how we see territory, how we think about national boundaries, and our own epistemic and ontological limitations. Thank you.
Just need a moment to set up here. Oh, the other one. Okay, all right. Okay, thank you so much. First of all, thank you for inviting me. A big shout out to the Kogut Institute for all of your work organizing this and for bringing me a very long way to be here. I was born in a country now known as Canada and grown up within the Great Lakes St. Lawrence watershed on Treaty 3 territory adjacent to Six Nations land. And as Brian already mentioned, I've now been living and working for about 3 years on Gadigal land in Sydney, Australia, alongside a tidal estuary known as the Cooks River that flows out to Botany Bay and eventually into the Pacific Ocean. Ancestrally and somewhat interstitially, I've also been brought up by the waters of the Baltic Sea. And I mention all of this not only because I've been taught it's good manners to say where you're coming from at a sort of situation like this, but also because it's recently occurred to me that I'm developing a sort of implicit methodology of trying to bring all of these very different waters and shores into my work. And I'm wondering if that's kind of a way of my body telling me that I need to come to grips with being a settler in a very unsettled way that academia asks of us these days. I think some of you might know a bit about that. So what I'm going to offer you today, my sort of scripted talk is about 20 minutes, so I hope you'll indulge me with a bit of intro. It's kind of an experiment, and sometimes experiments go wrong, so we'll see how it goes. But what I really wanted to do was experiment in sort of three things that I'm grappling with as an environmental humanities scholar at the moment. First of all, one of these really pressing issues for me are rather the tensions and possibilities between a white settler, feminist, queer sort of practice and Black and Indigenous feminisms. Particularly, I think, within an ecological space, resonant with some of the talks we've already heard today, thinking a lot about the politics of extraction and solidarity and thinking about how to learn from without violence, which I think is not always an easy thing to do. So that's one thing I'm trying to experiment with in what I'm giving you today. Secondly, I'm also interested in trying to interrupt some of the institutional regimes and genres of environmental humanities scholarship, which I think not always, but sometimes goes against some of the very concepts that we're trying to champion and promote in our work. So how can we sort of, as scholars, try to embody some of the things that we would like to sort of make manifest in the world? And finally, more on a sort of research agenda, I'm very interested in how we know the sea and how we write the sea, and as both a material place, but also a metonym for everything about planetarity that is unknowable and inaccessible to us. So there are no easy answers to any of those questions, so, experimentation is sometimes the way to go. So that's what I'm going to do. Finally, one little caveat, or not caveat, but at the end of my talk, I do have a few screens of references, and there's a soundtrack, and I'd appreciate it if you just sort of took the moment to sort of read through those references. They're very important to me and to the talk. So when the soundtrack ends, the talk's over. And I won't go over time, I promise. Short and sweet. Okay, so let's begin. Except it's not beginning. Best laid plans, you know how it is. That should be going. You need us to get a technical? It was, we practiced this perfectly. I have unmuted the volume, so it should be, my volume should be up now. No, we've tried it. It was all good. Don't worry. My volume's up.
But you don't have it embedded. You have another.
No, but we tried it. It was all good.
Yeah, this is all.
We tried it right before the break, and it should work. Can you just mute the screen for a second? Thanks. See, this is the good thing about having a slightly short talk. You can have room for technical glitches. This is the right thing. This is the right thing. I don't know why. Let's try this. Okay, we're good. I figured it out. Okay, good. We're all good. Put that down a bit. Mute it just. And I'm going to start again in just a minute. All right. Okay, pretend none of that happened. We're good. (2067) The Sea and the Breathing. The sea is another story. A century of ocean had made the paper too heavy to matter anymore, but the words written by lesbian feminist poet Adrienne Rich in 1972 were still legible in the waves. I came to explore the wreck, she said, having slipped off the edge of her sun-drenched schooner. Falling, floating, sinking, she had declared, "You breathe differently down here." And then for many, she had simply slipped from view. Now, looking back on that wreck, from this wreck of another order, we tried to parse the problem. When had we started taking on water? How had no one noticed? When had the air become so thin? After all, in spite of the deniers, we had invested in so many pretty knowledge machines. But while we had grappled with graphs and wrangled many numbers, risk projections and futuring scenarios had left us strangely unmoved. We had thought scientific certainty in its seeming irrefutability would save us. It always seems like a good idea to count things, after all. But the closer we had apparently come to the thing itself, the more it had escaped us. We had asked about the what, and we had tried to track the how, but it seemed we had forgotten all about the why. What did we want so badly that made all of the science just a kind of futile shouting into the benthos? What we had really needed then was to come to grips with our planetary intimacies and how those intimacies were also extimacies. Ourselves far-flung, recomposed, and resettled in new forms of eddied existence. We had needed to understand that the damage wrought was soaking in our belly, settling in our bones, but also carried on our own hot breath to places we never imagined our bodies could travel. Femur, spleen, intercellular fluid, were these not just the lithosphere, the biosphere, the hydrosphere, taking on more radically localized names? Not only were our earthly bodies porous, they were also stretched, shattered, diffracted. We were so beside ourselves. We had needed to learn that we were always already swimming at the bottom of the sea, with or without our submersibles. To be fair, we had begun to do the inventory. Plastic polymers, fishing nets, phosphorus, nitrogen, radioactive isotopes, seismic blasts, carbon dioxide, flip-flops, rubber ducks, unexploded bombs, shipwrecks, plane wrecks, bodies, lots and lots of bodies, cigarette filters, medical waste, crude oil, palm oil, mercury, cadmium, arsenic, lead, flame retardants, pirates' booty, herbicides, pesticides, animal fat, antidepressants, fidget spinners, hockey stick graphs, a typewriter. Eventually, someone crossed the whole list out and just wrote, "You name it, it's here." One of our surveys had recorded a lobster in the North Atlantic with a Pepsi logo tattoo. Another had captured a Mariana snailfish deep in the Pacific, swimming between the car tires, a crustacean's green glow like a beacon or a warning, illuminating that snailfish's see-through guts. The seafloor is so hard to fathom. We had come to understand the sea as a sink for our man-made matters, but we had still failed to grasp that it was also an archive of our feelings. We had kept trying to measure the anthropogenic ocean, but how could we calculate that maelstrom of desire, the want that pulsed so hot and large beneath the waves? What was the Earth system's analog for nervous system or heart, we now wondered? Or for the vulnerable softness on the underside of your chin? None of us had thought to ask that at the time. None of us had thought to ask, why isn't our water a vital bodily organ too? And the sea could remember so much. We hadn't banked on that. But with its extraordinary molecular ability to dissolve both acids and bases, the oceans had also become forgetful. This absent-mindedness had sometimes provided good cover for the follies of our youth. While some of the sunken afterlives of our wars returned persistently to haunt us, other chemical warfare agents such as sulfur mustard and phosgene were more readily forgotten, hydrolyzed, neutralized by the hungry tide. All the haste to bury those bodies at sea might not have been as stupid as it, in retrospect, had seemed. Few would have predicted that a plastic Kinder Surprise toy would become more memorable to the ocean than a sunken chemical bomb. In fairness, though, by the time we had gotten around to looking into these things, the seafloor was already so breathless. Under conditions of hypoxia and suffocation, memory disorders are difficult to account for with precision. We hadn't noticed, or perhaps we simply hadn't cared, that this tug between memory and forgetting was not something we could manipulate at will. Like most relationships, it was complicated. The ocean's convivial intimacy with CO2 meant that seawater could become carbonic acid, and so it began to forget elkhorn corals and sea butterfly shells too. Tropical fish began to forget where they lived. Swaths of kelp forest gone without a trace. Forgetting, in all of these ways, was also a feeling. Could it be that there was something else we wanted? Another surveyor had strayed from the designated teams. Whale shark, she recorded, 300 fetal specimens harboring in her twinned uteri. Coral reef, she wrote, just barely. Microbe, medusae, phytoplankton. Light, just barely. Bioluminescent. When the seas had begun rising in earnest, those of us on the shore had tilted our necks back for one collective last breath, which was never quite the last. We no longer saw the bodies piled beneath our feet to make us always just another few inches taller. We were all in this together, it had seemed, but we'd gotten the lifeboat ethics all wrong. That is, the question of the we was a grammatical legacy that kept tripping us up. While our bodies had ingested and extended the seas, it had become too easy to talk about ourselves as a species. We, a material affective hydrocommons of human and more than human life, stretched and torquing through time. We, unfortunately, had forgotten that when Adrienne Rich had written about we who are one, she had also added, we who are different, and we who do not want to be the same. If we were all in this hydrocommons together, we were hardly in this altogether, all in the same way. At one point, an earlier point, some would have disaggregated our claim to a we according to nation or gender or race. But many of us had thought that in the puddle of planetary crisis, such politics were passé. Who can afford to talk about misogyny or empire or white supremacy while the planet burns and drowns, we had demanded. So the newly configured politics cut like this: the thirsty and the sated, the parched and the bloated, those on the shore staring outwards, unable to tell the difference between waving and drowning, and those lost forever at sea. It took us too long to understand that these new markers were in fact the old ones, just by another name. The problem was not and never was an identity politics. The problem was the alibi of that we, what it had covered over and whom it had pretended to include. Questions like gender and race and colonialism had not just been modern labels painted on our skin like a Pepsi logo tattoo. They were whole worlds forged through those same material, affective intimacies and extimacies. Not mere labels affixed to a jumper like a name badge, these markers were in fact the total weather. They were breathing rooms, structures communicated through tertiary bronchi, alveoli, squamous epithelium, by red blood cells to make some bodies matter in certain ways with certain consequences. And so these bodies were reaffirmed as bodies of water, coloniality ingested with every glass of boil water advisory, gender swimming in our rocket-fueled, flame-retarded breast milk, differences in wealth, ability, sex, age, documented in the numbers of every flood and every rogue wave, because some numbers drown and some numbers get military escorted the heck out of there. Sometimes it is a good idea to count things. Or put it this way, metrics have feelings too. We could have learned this had we bothered to read them properly, had we learned to pay attention to how these matters were also mattering. You breathe differently down here, wrote Adrienne Rich, while somewhere in New York a man named Eric Garner had uttered, "I can't breathe," while somewhere in New South Wales the midazolam unnecessarily injected into David Dungay Jr. had sucked from his body its last breaths, while somewhere in Western Australia a woman named Nita Blanquette, having been denied her asthma meds, had told the correctional officer, "I will die anyways," as the muscles around her airways tightened and didn't let go. Some disasters rage so slow and long that they become the air we breathe, bodies carried through blood-red cells. In the question of the we, then, political time might also be torqued and queer. We had vowed we're over this, we're past this, we're, post-race, post-gender, post-colonial. We had insisted. We need to think about the planet now. But the future had already been anticipated in that past, and the past kept swimming into the future, smuggled in the underbelly of words like environmental justice, ecofeminism, Black Lives Matter, Stop Adani, water is life. I'm worrying about what you're drinking, and you're worrying about what I'm breathing. This, Nishnabeg poet Leanne Berasamasoke Simpson's love letter to the oldest tree in the world. When the water had started tonguing our toes, we probably had looked to that tree. But instead of kin, we saw ladder. Instead of carrier bag, we saw instrumental escape, hand over hand, branch to branch to branch, hoping for height and a way up and out. If we had listened, we might have heard the murmurs trickling beneath the silver-white bark. Tree holds the water, water holds the tree. In canoe jail with Akawenza, the old ones had whispered to Quay, "Take the young one and run. Pull a fast one on, fake cop, drive to the lake, fill the young one's pockets with 7 stones. The tree holds the water, and the water holds the tree. The water holds the young ones safe when theft is safe return home. We hadn't known the language of Acquaenza, and Simpson's gift hadn't been meant for us, rightly so. We still only saw ladder, tall branch, hand over hand over hand. We still saw thief. We who are different, we who do not want to be the same. Feelings are like water. When hydrology became a science in the late 1700s, it attempted to calculate water according to atomistic, isolable, and exchangeable units. Water is water, and size, or in this case volume, was everything. These calculations could be a measure of an acceptable quality of life, 50 liters per person per day, we had suggested. According to these numbers, we had also attempted to calculate hydrological management on a global scale. But 1 cubic meter of tap water from Providence was not the same water that gathered up the toxicants of a garment drying industry in Xinjiang province to show up in a pair of blue jeans near you. Nor was this the water in an estuarine creek in northern Australia that, having changed her form already several times in the past, might change her form again under the pressures of extraction, drying her riverbeds and withdrawing her resources. And none of these waters is the water, underside massaged by the solid soft of lake floor pebbles, that carries a stolen canoe. Water in this way is also a feeling, always qualitative, singular, mattering differently. We had needed to learn to know the difference. We had needed to learn difference. The 6th extinction was good training ground. In that unsurprisingly named age of man, we had been asked to live at seemingly incommensurable multiple scales. If the Anthropocene demanded we come to grips with how we were etching ourselves into the earth, its deep time context simultaneously reminded us that we were no more significant than the tip of a fingernail on an outstretched arm. We were being encouraged to live radically in place, at the same time as we extended our flesh into the shadow places of our dumped desires. Intimacy was always already extimacy. But if scale is something that we had usually understood in respect to time or space, perhaps we needed to recall that time and space are inextricable from matter. That is, maybe we had needed to develop a better scalar imaginary of mattering. Our wounds and our wants were all interimplicated, but they had not all mattered in the same way. How were we to comprehend a Kinder Egg toy that mattered both more and less than a mustard gas bomb? How were we to parse the death of the Great Barrier Reef alongside the murder of a young man named Colton Bushey? All of our pretty knowledge machines had been incapable of measuring these differences and these samenesses. We hadn't realized that we didn't need comparison. What we needed was articulation. Back then and before then, Donna Haraway had taught us that all vision is prosthetic. As situated bodies, we would always see through and with the worlds that are our total weather. No God's eye view here. Why had we not realized that all breathing is prosthetic too? Lusa Rigori had worried we'd forgotten about air, but that really wasn't quite the matter. What we had forgotten were all of the prostheses that allowed us to breathe without noticing. It had taken the rising sea for us to realize that not all breathing came so easily. Where were our prostheses then? In her remarkable chapter on the weather, Christina Sharp has called attention to anti-blackness, the sea, and what she calls an archive of breathlessness, spanning from Fanon to Moten, black and breathing. The words had morphed in the wake, but no matter. She had pointed out that we revolt simply because we can no longer breathe. We who are different and we who do not want to be the same. We who had not known the difference necks back, mouths open, like baby birds, waiting. We who had not noticed that some of those bodies upon whom we stood, as we tried to grab hold of the highest branch of the oldest tree in the world, those bodies were busy growing gills and swim bladders, an aorta unhooked, a chordate future forgotten, the obsolescence of feet. Why were we surprised when those bodies learned to swim and when they learned to swim away? Here, the water is not waiting to waste you. Here, the sun is not stripping your skin. This is the dark water of renewal, offering only one message: begin. You breathe differently down here, and I wonder if water will forget this story too. All right, that's all. Thank you.
Thank you for those excellent presentations. I noticed that it's Saturday at 5 o'clock in the morning right now.
What is it?
So we're a little over time. But yeah, so we have quite a bit of time for questions, so the floor is open.
I might start by asking you a question and engaging your work, if that's okay, since no immediate hands went up right away. I really love how you brought, the audio track and a number of things to bear here, and breath, obviously, and that Christina Sharp's work is so crucial here in terms of thinking about toxic landscapes and their differential power, approaches. I'm also interested in the moments in which you brought not only kind of racialized subjectivities to the foreground, but you were really thinking from what I would call a queer decolonial perspective, and doing a lot of work to unpack the kind of normative viewpoints that are engaged in not only environmental humanities or responses, but a lot of kind of anti-normative work that was being done not only with genre and form, but I think also in your citational practice. So I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit to that. Do you identify with queer decolonial? I mean, that's something that I've really foregrounded in my work, and I think it's a similarity. So I would just say that. And then one last comment is I do notice something in compatibility in terms of our work, also the kind of protagonism what we're centering, what are the figures that we're centering? And, I'm trying to work with the sea and those images. You're definitely, the protagonism of water is enlivened here. So just something about that sensorium of creation I think is really interesting.
Yeah, thanks so much. And I loved being able to follow from your talk. And I mean, maybe just because I'm attuned to those things, but those images that were shown in the video of the divers at the end were just, I think in a very different way, a sort of similar imaginary I was trying to evoke, right? And that maybe this isn't just a future speculative imaginary, but it is this queer time that is already with us and already sort of resurfacing and resubmerging all the time, and so I'm looking forward to talking to you more about that. But as to your question, I think decolonial is a pretty heavy word, and what does it mean for a white settler girl to have a decolonial practice, I think is not really a simple question. And one thing I think I really tried to do in this piece that I haven't done before is, although I play a lot in sort of a feminist context with the pronoun we and who does it include and who does it mean, not that I expected anybody picked up on this in just listening to it once, but every time I used we in this piece, I was specifically invoking the structural we that I belong to as a white settler. Which is as a sort of Adrian Richian, something I've not really done. I've tried to always sort of invoke an intersectional we and thinking about we as solidarity, and I felt it really important, perhaps as part of a queer decolonial practice, to inhabit that structural we much more deliberately, and think about the work of that. And for me, that sort of throwing into the speculative future somehow made it sounds like I made it more possible for me in a writerly sort of way to sort of think about what is that structural we, the sort of white settler perspective 50 years from now, and what are we doing? What are we doing?
Can I ask a question that actually just follows on that? So through your entire presentation, I was listening to the breathing as you clearly intended, and it struck me that your choice of the recording of someone breathing through a scuba diving apparatus underwater, I'm curious if you might elaborate that as a choice. And the reason I ask is that my experience of breathing through that kind of device is you become very aware, even though it's supposed to calibrate to the pressure of the relative water around you, become very aware of the fact that the air you're breathing is increasing in pressure as you descend. And that's very different from the way everything else in the sea experiences air. And so I was just curious if that was deliberate, if that was a sort of audio commentary on what you were saying, and if you might, for those of us who might not tap into all of the semiotics of what you were doing, if you might be able to clarify that.
And I think a lot of those semiotics are exactly like that, to be inferred as one wishes. But yes, it is a deliberate choice to have the scuba apparatus, and I suppose that goes to the point that I'm trying to make, that Christina Sharp and Fred Moten and Fanon, so many people have done such important work on the labor that it is to breathe in our current context. I think the scuba apparatus was sort of to point out my point that all breathing is prosthetic, and that breathing easily is because we have a prosthetic of privilege, surrounding us. And the idea of the seas rising, and this is not a myth, right? The seas are rising, how a certain we is going to have to think about those prosthetics of breath a lot more consciously. And on the sort of notion of the scuba, if I were really technologically savvy, it would have started as scuba breath and then sort of slowly changed to sort of maybe a more bubbly sort of actual breathing water breath, but that's in a more technologically advanced version. That was just a YouTube video of scuba noises. But what's interesting, when I've done a bit of scuba diving, but not much, because I'm terribly claustrophobic, and one of the things about the apparatus is, although you are in this, your body experiences, as most of you probably know, this amazing sense of space being underwater, and the weightlessness, although you have the pressure, and that expansiveness. In a sense, it's the most claustrophobic you could ever be, because all of your breath is just right here, and in your. So I think there's something to be thought about there as well.
Thank you for those wonderful talks. I think I have a question for Astrida, but it's possible Macarena would want to comment because she brought up Christina Sharp. So my question has to do with whether there's an easy combining of the concept of weather in Christina Sharp and the concept of breathing with an environmental perspective. So I take as stipulated in your talk that you are deeply committed to both environmentalism and, let's just stick with Christina Sharp, racial justice. Though anti-blackness, I should say, because she doesn't actually typically use the term race. But the chapter on weather, which you had in your fabulous bibliography, you know, the concept of not being able to breathe in that chapter has to do with a toxic anti-black climate, and not really the climate, or anything having to do with the environment, in the sense of, you know, global climate change and the impending catastrophe, or the ongoing catastrophe. And so I wonder, you know, and interestingly, in Ray we, her we is powerfully exclusive, meaning it's inclusive of blackness, but it is exclusive of anything outside of that. So I think it's really fascinating to think about your we, you know, and kind of a reflexive use of we in the current conditions. But I just find myself, like, I think it's, how can I put this? I think it's recognizable to affiliate with both projects, but I wonder about whether there can be a metaphorical, poetic, and I'm going to use a strong term here just to see what you say, conflation, or, you know, like blurring. So that's my question.
That is the question, right? I think the way you articulated it initially, Amanda, was you asked, is there an easy fit? And no, I mean, it's not an easy fit at all. But I think that is the work, you know? It's the work of how do you not compare or analogize, but how do you articulate? And I think, you know, Macarena, your talk, you know, it is cultural justice, it is social justice, it's environmental justice, and these things are not unrelated, you know, they're all tangled up. And so it's never an easy fit, and it's really painstaking, I think, ethical work that, you know, I fail at, others fail at, you know, but it doesn't mean it shouldn't be done. And, you know, my experience in the environmental humanities, particularly in the contexts I come from, they are such white spaces, so white, you know, and that's not to say that there isn't amazing environmental thinking going on in other spaces. So how, you know, like articulating those moments is just so crucial. I'll give just because I have the mic. I've just recently co-written a little piece called Weathering that's coming out in Feminist Review tomorrow or something, I don't know, the next time it comes out, where we actually, Jennifer Hamilton and I, make an argument for really changing the way we think about this concept of weathering as both gathering climate and environmental questions as always inseparable from questions that we might otherwise call social justice ones, because well, that is what environmental justice is, right? Yeah, so, and really thinking about weathering as a material imprinting on all kinds of bodies of the weather and environments, broadly construed. So it's not, you know, it's a, like all concepts, it's a salvo, you know, like what do people want to do with this? Does this work? Does this not? I'm not saying it's the answer, but I think it's an interesting, for me, thought project to sort of start thinking through. Maybe you want to add?
Yeah, maybe I will add to that because it's, I think, a really complicated question, and I think it cuts to the core of kind of present-day citational politics and the really important dimensions and ethics of citational practice, that I think there are conversations that are convergent, conversations that are completely missing each other, and then conversations that kind of take as their necessary starting point some of these citations. And I would even say in the space of today, the ways in which we have started with a kind of US-Canadian settler kind of condition that comes, you know, brings certain conversations that are, hate to use temporalities, but I'll talk about them as in a lot of ways a lot more advanced in certain discussions around indigeneity in the US currently, where anti-Black racism has become really, really important because of Black Lives Matter and the work that a lot of scholars of Black political thought have done. And then a very different and ongoing conversation on extractive capitalism that has become much more to the foreground now here. But, you know, if we look at those spaces of indigenous struggle, coalitional work, work in particular spaces, there's a longer arc of them, Americas, in Ecuador, for instance. So how we have those conversations and who is in those conversations matters quite a bit. And I think we have to be very, very careful. And that's one thing that I do think, although the decolonial can be a very heavy baggage, now it's been, you know, unmoored from a lot of those citational practices, but it really is about citing scholars from around, you know, peripheral spaces and bringing those, foregrounding those conversations that I think in a lot of an environmental humanities sometimes occludes, right? So how to kind of begin these cross currents to go back to the Galapagos space. One of the reasons it's so fecund there is it's because the intersection of 4 ocean currents. So these currents are really, really important. But let me say one other thing. I think there's a move, right, to think also about scholarly work as an extractive zone. And I think that's right to consider that next step and to see how, for instance, Black political thought or indigenous critique or decolonial feminist and queer scholarship, again, becomes unmoored and cycled to do a particular kind of work of valorization in the academy. And I think we have to be just as careful to do that. And how we go about that is part, I think, of a new important kind of politics of, you know, mobilizing the citation in interesting ways. So I hope that addresses some of it. Okay, that's great.
Hi. Astrida, you were rubbing our noses in, I guess would be a good way of saying this, that we're terrestrial creatures with the scuba breathing apparatus. And Macarena, you were suggesting the use of archipelagic thinking to help us get away from what some of us call terracentric thinking. And I'd like to hear from both of you, especially from Macarena, the extent to which some of these alternatives that we're offering to help us think about the ocean space as an essential space within the environmental humanities, both open up spaces for us, but also close them down. And to give a specific example, this is something I struggle with directly also as an Andeanist, is that when we actually draw our archipelagos, in your case, you connected Patagonia to the Aymara in highlands of Peru and Bolivia, to the Quechua and Amazonia, et cetera, other South American stories, when you could have potentially connected your story to the turning Rapa Nui Easter Island into a giant sheep ranch, turning Australia, New Zealand into even gianter, if that's a word, sheep ranches. I think you're getting what I'm getting at. I'd love to hear you comment on both the strengths and some of the potential pitfalls from using something like archipelagic thinking or breathing space as ways of engaging with the environment that's going to win the Anthropocene, the ocean.
Well, that's really a wonderful comment question rather than just question. And, you know, I think what you're bringing up, again, is not dissimilar from the previous kind of discussion about knowledge production and the ways in which certain forms of knowledge production force us into kind of area studies or a territorial localized model. And I think what I've learned very importantly from indigenous, and this is US indigenous critique, is to take the locale very seriously, right? So not to abandon kind of just look at the colonial archive, but to work with indigenous inhabitants and the kind of ontologies in specific locations. Now, the problem with doing that is then you become so site-specific as to not be able to travel and transit and say something beyond. And this really is a post-colonial question, right, about the universal and the particular that I'm putting back to the foreground. But one of the things I did in my book is precisely to suggest, what if we took something like the permanent forms of insurrection in the Andes, to use Silvia Rivera Cusicanqui's work, and make her as an Andean intellectual very, very central to the project of decolonial feminist critique, then what you get is an ability to say something more broadly, actually. And I think it is important in a US academic context, speaking in English, to have that work travel in transit from south to north in particular ways. I'm not quite answering your question yet, but I will. And so Silvia Rivera Cusicanqui's work does figure, pretty centrally, but then I'm also interested in how an Andean radical tradition would speak to a Black radical tradition, and then do some of those linking work there, right, to suggest that there have been ongoing and permanent forms of rebellion in relationship to extractive zones. Now, the Rapa Nui is a really, really important case. I haven't gotten to it in this new work yet. It fell out of the extractive zone. And in fact, this is the first work I'm actually turning to oceans. And I've gotten there by my own graduate PhD students who have said, you've looked at rivers, you've looked at mining, you've looked at mega, extractive industries, but you're still thinking with the territories in precisely those ways. So this is, even when I was kind of reading up there, I'm realizing how early this work is, but I'm constantly brought there by Guzman's cinematic view. Something about Patricio Guzman, he always gets there ahead of me, which is fine because then I can do the work through him. But he does something really, really specific, which I think is precisely to locate, right, this idea of the archipelago, to do this satellite view, to think from within the ocean, to think, so it's not that I want to privilege one archipelago view, I want to think with him and his beautiful forms of visuality that we need so much now to kind of go against the universalisms of Google, the Google eye, right? Something else is quite a textured view, and I want to use that as a center of a kind of theoretical production as well. So I hope that answers some of it.
What is positive and what are the risks of sort of trying to deterritorialize sort of our ways of thinking and knowing. I could say so much about this, but maybe let's just leave it at, probably so many binaries we've come to suspect. The sort of ocean and land one is another one, So I really liked your work because it wasn't it was both. And in my own, I'm really interested in the sea floor, which is also a territory, right? So different kinds of knowledge practices, methodologies, imaginaries that try to disrupt this idea that there's the sea and the land, but that they're both completely interdependent biophysically and imaginatively, I think is really important work. That said, my whole scholarly project is invested in trying to see what happens when we do sort of dip below the water, and what happens to our ways of knowing, and what happens to our understandings of everything: justice, truth, knowledge, ethics, conviviality, relationship, space-time. It all sort of changes a bit, and I think that's an important movement in a broader sort of perhaps decolonial queer project. Time is my current interest, how time works very differently under the water.
Any other questions? No? I guess that's it then. Thank you very much.
Right at the closing times.
Oh, great. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
We have a half an hour.